Hey, folks, welcome back to the show. We've got our final segment here, and we hope you've enjoyed the first two that we've had. And of course, if you're watching this by video through our social media channels, it's not just Michelle and me today. There are also some great segments that we hosted on the timeline for admissions for the fall. And we talked about Naviance in the first segment. So go ahead and look those up on Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever you get your college coach content. All right, I've sort of buried the lead here. Michelle Richardson is here joining me for our final segment. Hey, Michelle, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ian. Thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you. As I said off the air, you are a pro at this. I imagine that most of our listeners will recognize your voice and your expertise. So we are going to jump right in to a general sense of what some families should be doing this fall to think about the process of paying for college. And so one of the first things that I think comes up is the cost of attendance. And this is a conversation I'm having with a lot of families right now. How do we think about what these colleges are actually going to cost, and how does that influence our decision about where we're going to send applications? What does that question kind of look like right now?
Right. And those of us on the finance side are having this conversation daily, multiple times a day right
Good.
now.
I'm going to send my families over to you to keep having them with you. Yeah.
So I think as students start to look at schools and parents start to look at schools and they start digging into the true cost, typically the first go-to is looking at the cost of attendance, which is basically the all-in price for 1 year. And I encourage families to go through each line item. There are direct costs like tuition and fees, obviously, room and board, but then there are indirect costs that schools estimate, which may or may not be applicable to families. And so oftentimes families might get that sticker shock price, especially if they're looking at maybe a private school or maybe an out-of-state public. But look at those line items with that cost of attendance as you start to compare apples to apples from a paying for college perspective.
And I know that you all on the finance side are big fans of spreadsheets. Is this something where you would encourage families to start laying these numbers out side by side so they can compare schools?
Absolutely. One great, I think, item to kind of think about is, let's say the student is looking at schools where there could be no transportation cost in that line item, or maybe they're looking at a school across the country. And if they're going to be flying back and forth 3 times, 4 times a year, that obviously is going to increase that transportation cost. So it really depends on the family and how they're looking at the overall cost of attendance. But as a finance person, we love spreadsheets.
Yeah. Yeah. We love to use them too. And would totally encourage families to use that stuff. In terms of flying across the country, my dad would have just said, why don't you stay at college for Christmas? Okay.
Yes.
What about, speaking of conversations, tough conversations with your parents, you talked about, and we've had this conversation before, the talk.
Yes.
And just establishing what a family can afford and how that fits the student's goals. Any recommendations for when that should happen, whether it's just a final putting your foot down or if it's an ongoing conversation over the course of the fall?
Right. I think having that talk, as we like to call it, should be ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if families have not discussed finances and perhaps the resources that the family has available to pay for college, and what those expectations are from both the student perspective and the parent perspective. So a lot of times we will talk with parents and have them say, does your student know how much resources, whether that's savings or cash flow, or are you willing to finance? Do you want the student to take out a student loan? Setting those expectations and having that conversation sooner and ongoing as they look at the cost of attendance and look at what schools have the, whole package and are the right fit with other aspects of the student. It should be an ongoing conversation. So there aren't any shocks or, having that conversation next spring when they get into their maybe dream school and then
It's no good.
that can be a challenge.
That can be a challenge. Yeah. And if you're
Yes.
interested in exploring this a little bit more fully, I know that I had this conversation with Tara about a month and a half ago where we really
Sure.
got into the talk. So go on back into the archives and have a look at that. One of the other big questions, Michelle, that I've run into just with families in the last couple of weeks is, all right, well, we can see what the cost is, the sticker price, and we can do an EFC calculator and figure out what kind of need we're going to qualify for. But what about scholarships? How do we know how much scholarships are going to factor into the process? Can you talk a little bit about whether scholarships are included as a part of that net price calculator that colleges have? And if they're not, then how do students and families, think about the role of these merit scholarships in their process?
Sure, sure. This is a big question. So, merit scholarships are dollars, and oftentimes they're a tuition discount, and they're awarded by admissions during the admission process in order to recruit students. And sometimes I think that that message gets lost.
Right.
With that, there are schools that have not and don't offer merit. So obviously that is a component, especially if a family may not qualify for need-based financial aid, to know that there are schools that don't offer merit, but there are a significant number of schools that do. A challenge with the net price calculators is, generally speaking, most of them only look at the need-based component, like you said. So there is a resource like the average merit scholarship is available on College Navigator or the College Board's website, Big Future. So sometimes families can dig into that data there. What is a challenge for families is many schools are not transparent on their website when it comes to merit scholarships. We have a few that have a wonderful calculator that says if you have this GPA and if you have this test score, and if you're a resident in state or out of state, this is your estimated scholarship, which makes that process a little bit easier. Most schools are not that transparent. So a couple of things that families should know, and they should be doing this as they're looking at schools. Students need to be looking at each individual school's website for the merit scholarship information for incoming students. Some schools will have a supplemental scholarship application above and beyond the admission application.
Right.
We even have some schools, even like the UC system this last year implemented, where you have to complete the financial aid applications in order to be considered for merit.
Okay.
And we're starting to see a few more schools do that, kind of as a double check to make sure that they do file for need-based financial aid. And if they're eligible, they receive that aid, whether it's from the federal or state government. Another component that students need to look for regarding merit are deadlines, priority deadlines.
Yeah. And USC comes to mind with that one, where they've got a December 1st deadline for consideration for scholarships, and their regular deadline's out in January. If you don't apply by December 1st, you can't get a scholarship. And so apply by December 1st. Like that's,
Right.
You have to do that.
And it does vary by schools. I've seen schools that have no November deadlines. We have schools, December into January. We have some that don't, but we also have some schools that will award their merit first come, first serve. So obviously you don't want to miss those opportunities.
And so just linking, I think what Ryan was saying in the last segment, along with what you're saying in this segment, there's a lot of, we talked about getting supplemental essay topics right out in front of you, making sure you can see everything you need to do in order to write those essays. And this is the same kind of thing on the finance side. Get all of the pieces out in front of you, put it into a spreadsheet, get a notebook, figure everything out so that you are clear on what to expect. Michelle, my understanding is that with recruitment aid, with merit scholarships, you're never going to know exactly how much you get until you actually get into that school. So you can have even sometimes a rough idea, but the actual offer doesn't come until the offer comes.
Absolutely.
But it can help guide you a little bit.
Right.
Now, what about the deadline for applying for need-based financial aid. So many families are going to go ahead and do this. They're going to have to complete the FAFSA, coming up this fall. What are some key dates for them to keep an eye out for as they're working through that process?
Sure. So one thing the FAFSA, the federal financial aid application, as well as the CSS profile, which is another financial aid application that about a little over 200 schools utilize, those will not be available until October 1st.
Okay.
I've already talked to some families who have I tried to go out and fill out the FAFSA, and I'm like, time out, you can't, it's not ready yet. So obviously, knowing that they become available on October 1st, knowing that you don't have to stay up until midnight on September 30th to complete it, but try to get it done. We like to say early to mid-October, if at all possible, with the financial aid application. So that's a big date. Now, there is something that families can do now to prepare for that. So with the FAFSA, both the student and one of the parents has to create what we call a FSA ID username and password. And it's basically their electronic signature. And that is something families can do now. And it really kind of helps streamline that FAFSA completion process in October. So that is something that families can do now. Kind of going back to what we talked about with merit and your comment regarding spreadsheets. Schools have financial aid application deadlines. We have states that have FAFSA deadlines. So do be aware, again, check each school, their financial aid application information on their website to make sure that, again, there's not any deadlines you are missing. And the other final thing that I think families can do right now is kind of start to gather the information. So you can go out and look at the FAFSA that's currently available and kind of see what you're going to need to complete it. So that process is very smooth, like bank statements, financial documents for untaxed income, like maybe child support, driver's license, all of those kind of investment retirement fund statements, real estate valuations, and your 2020 federal tax information, including your W-2s.
All kinds of fun stuff to gather
Yes.
and put together. And I would imagine, am I right that my college finance colleagues, they do all their taxes in February as soon as they get their W-2s? You guys are just like right on top of the deadlines.
Right on top.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Hey, Michelle, thanks for coming and talking us through some of this stuff. I think it's going to be really helpful for families to have these reminders.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ian.
Happy to have you. All right, folks, that does it for our show this week. We're going to be back again next week, as we always are. We'll have Sally in the hosting chair. We'll be continuing the conversation of stories from our team and what their college experiences were like with Lisa Albro. So you'll want to join us for that. We'll also talk through some of the UC personal insight questions, and we'll get an update from our finance experts on the mandatory administrative forbearance, right? So important topics, if not super exciting, but they are exciting, right? Yes. We look forward to having you back here as listeners next week. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend. Take care.